It's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother with me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving up that stuff. I can't. There's good friends of mine out there to say. Well, he's the boss, you have to do his stuff. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the boss means that the boss is your boss.
We are going to get into the Philadelphia mob history. I know we've covered this before, but I felt like I didn't do it good enough. So I went all out. And this is going to be a large progression. And when I say that, what I mean is this is going to be multiple episodes. And I think you guys are going to enjoy it. So specifically what I want from all of you who are listening is after you listen to this episode, I want you to email the show at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com and let me know what you think of this episode. It's important to me because I want to make sure that I'm bringing you the facts and I'm bringing you stuff nobody's ever said before. That's what I aim to do, and that's what makes me the best at what I do. So, to be honest, there's always going to be a debate on when the Mafia arrived, specifically in Philadelphia. As Western Sicilians were flooding the shores of New York, Boston, and Pennsylvania in general, there's really not a concise answer to that. But there are a few clues as to when Philadelphia first saw its first wave, or at least the early incarnation of the Mafia in Philadelphia. And in 1896, the Secret Service arrested a slew of Sicilian men in New York who had formed a counterfeiting network which stretched into Philadelphia, Baltimore, Scranton, and other coal-rich regions in Pennsylvania. It's also been reported that the Secret Service also pursued reputed Mafia activities in Philadelphia through 1903 in connection with other police and major U.S. cities. But they had little to no significant findings. In fact, the really first noted initiation ceremony, people think, was released by informants in the past 50 years. But in actuality, at a trial in Palermo in August of 1877, defendants brought up on charges testified in court about their initiation ceremonies, which involved a finger pricking and the burning of a sacred image before their fellow mob members. So a lot of people think that we've only known about an induction ceremony in the last 40 years or whatever, but this goes back to 1877. And the Mafia, as we know, goes back to medieval ages, the 1200s, 1232, I believe. And we also know that they arrived on American shores as the Black Hand, establishing themselves first in New Orleans. But it really truly wasn't until 1907 that the press began to refer to the Black Hand, who had rooted themselves and embedded themselves into Pennsylvania. And the first incarnation of the Mafia, obviously, as we know it, is the Black Hand, and they actively participated in shakedowns, murders, blackmail, kidnappings, and more. And they were not to be trifled with. And in 1910, a bomb was set off in Philadelphia's Little Italy between two row houses located on 907 and 909 South 9th Street. While the bombs blew out the windows and tossed people out of their beds, people still refused to pay money to the Black Hand. And so the bombings didn't change the narrative in South Philadelphia. And even though there were some deaths associated with the Black Hand in 1914, 1921, and 1922, none of these murders or deaths could be related in any way to the Mafia. And while there were small enclaves of what we might consider the mob, the reality is there wasn't enough men from Castellamare del Golfo, Palermo, or anywhere else to really form a united organized group. And the first time that the Mafia is mentioned, albeit publicly, is in 1903 when the Philadelphia Inquirer mentioned the possibility that the Mafia existed based on police reports from a few residents in South Philadelphia. At another incident, Magistrate Tuffhill held three fine-looking men, a type much above the Italian scene in the street and the railroad laboring gangs, for threatening a woman that same year. But the magistrate's opinion of that the threats to the woman came from men in an organization akin to the Mafia that was extorting money in Philadelphia's Little Italy. Former gangster Nick Gentile would say that he would recount a time when he was already known in Boston and Chicago as a power to be reckoned with. And by the time he became initiated to the mob in Philadelphia, he was 21 years old. And the most important event in Gentile's life, he didn't give further elaboration as to the circumstances in Philadelphia that made the city the venue for his initiation ceremony. Gentile was from Sicily in the province of Agrigento, which is a few miles west of the city, or he was born in the province, which was a few miles west of Agrigento on the island's coast. There were some immigrants that were there from Agrigento and Philadelphia, but there's no firm evidence to substantiate that they were in fact mobsters. Gentile would claim, however, at the time he became a made guy in Philadelphia, other cities and states were officially formed in New York, especially in Brooklyn, and that there were 2,000 associates by 1906. One mobster in the 1920s claimed that many bosses lived outside of Philadelphia and in the New Jersey suburbs, but he was not sure who was in the hierarchy, but he said that the family was in fact organized and interacted with New York. It's also been said that there were rivals, fringe rivals in Luzerne County and in Montgomery counties who totally bypassed the Philadelphia Mafia and associated and had deals in place with New York. So even from day one in Philly, there was multiple crews operating. And what's interesting, and this may shed some light on the historical issues of the Philadelphia Mafia, is that there was never a huge influx of Sicilians from the same town settling in Philadelphia. And it seems when you look, historically at functional families, they often came from the same town. Castellamare del Golfo, for example. And guys from the same town have the same ideals, but in Philadelphia, even from those early days, ethnic bylines or viewpoints were totally different. And there was never a foundation of simpatico, meaning you didn't have 10 guys from the same village that all thought the same. Everybody was from all over the place. What did unite them, however, what did unite the mob in general was from being from Western Sicily. Versus like Villabate, for example. So in contrast, they had, the viewpoints, but they were not aligned foundationally in their beliefs. And the other facet, which gets little to no attention, is that Philadelphia, unlike other Sicilian families, say in New York, did not intermarry into powerful families. Had early bosses in Philadelphia married into powerful New York families, the trajectory of Philadelphia would be very, very different. And because of that, New York families historically would dominate Philadelphia. So in the early days, Philadelphia had to pay New York protection money. A lot of people don't know that. They were allowed only to exist based on the principle and that principle alone, that they were paying protection money. The other issue facing them in Philadelphia was that the Sicilian members literally needed protection from the Calabrese and the Neapolitans. And this went on for almost 15 years, from 1905 to 1920. So the earliest known boss that many accept is Salvatore Sabella, but we know now that that's really not the case. There was actually many more bosses prior to him. In fact, in the early days, at the Italian market on 9th Street, they were actually paying the Sicilian Mafia to protect them from the Black Hand and the Camorra. And the Mafia protected these vendors with vigor. And often when one of the Sicilian mobsters died, the stores would honor him. Everything would close in the Italian market. They would hang black sashes across the windows as tributes. Most shopkeepers or storekeepers at the prominent market in Philadelphia's Little Italy were not aware that a fellow storekeeper who was a shot caller in the mob. Salvatore Sabella was an unassuming guy. He was a very well-liked guy, a very well-respected guy, and had been in Philadelphia since 1914. And by the 1920s, he had a successful olive oil and cheese store, which he ran with his brother-in-law Leonard. He also ran a cafe during Prohibition called the Third Ward Republican Club. It was the first real front social club in South Philly. They called him Don Turandot, and not many realized just how influential and important he was to the Philadelphia underworld. And as we know, he was the boss from 1919 until around 1931, and because he was smart enough to retire relatively young at age 40. And he legit would live on to watch 5 more bosses come and go in Philadelphia. So Salvatore Sabella was born in western Sicily, Castellamare del Golfo, which is an island with deep valleys and mountains. And in 1891, when Sabella was born, the Mafia was already in full swing in Italy. They had already controlled political influence, trade, law enforcement, and domestic economics. Per criminologist Cesare Lombroso, and what he said, there were wide differences of beliefs of the people that were on western side of the island versus the eastern side. They had 2 different viewpoints. They had separate ideologies completely. And so while Sabella didn't grow up poor, he was not middle class either, just a hair below middle class. And his family could actually afford to send him to school where he was able to learn to read, write, and do math, which was just enough in those days, just enough education to help him earn a living when the time came. His father, John, and his mother, Rosa, were able to get Salvatore an apprenticeship early on at a slaughterhouse. But while he was at that slaughterhouse, he was beaten and abused constantly by an overbearing boss. And the amount of abuse that he suffered at 14 years old was unspeakable. And this took place every single day, and the beatings were awful. But Salvatore never tells his parents. Instead, in 1905, not being able to take any more of this guy's shit, Salvatore pulls a knife and stabs him to death. A few years later, he would be caught for that crime and would be sent to Milan to do 3 years in prison for murder. So when Salvatore gets released from prison in Milan, the Mafia had begun to get a bit of press, especially in 1909 after Joe Petrosino, who we talked about a couple weeks ago, I think last week maybe, gets clipped in Sicily. And so when Sabella exits prison in Milan, he finds himself back at home, and he quickly sees that the Mafia has grown much more powerful. And one of the reasons why the Mafia had grown more powerful in Sicily was the connection between Raphael Piazzolo, who was a mob boss and a member of the Italian parliament, Don Vito Casciafero, who had deep pockets and political allies, and Giovanni Giolitti, who was the prime minister of Italy. And they were all aligned and all gangsters. And they completely controlled the west side of Sicily, and anybody who tried to meddle would be killed without hesitation. And why Sabella left Italy likely had more to do with his family standing in Italy. In Sicily. They were not a wealthy family, nor were they considered elite by anybody's standards. And this is why Sabella likely decides to leave for American shores. So in 1912, Sabella arrives on Ellis Island. And from there, he would head to Brooklyn, New York. And he settled there specifically because of the Castellamare in Brooklyn. People from his own village, people from his own town. That's where he needed to be. And it was simply go where you feel most comfortable among your peers, where people understand you. And what has been reported over the years has actually been a bit of over speculation based on minuscule FBI reports. And what we know is that Sabella was allegedly sent to Philadelphia by Giuseppe Traina, who wanted a Castellamare mob in Philadelphia. It's also been said that he was a captain within the Salvatore D'Aquila organization. However, there really isn't anything definitive, and it's more speculation versus actual fact. And there is no document that points us in one way or the other that says for sure whether or not Sabella was inducted in New York or Philly. However, I tend to believe it was New York versus Philadelphia, and we don't even really know why Sabella was chosen to be the one guy to go to Philly either. But the one thing that stands out more than others was the fact that he was from Western Sicily and he grew up in a culture of the Mafia, a culture where honor and respect were everything. And 5 years into his criminal life, his name moved to the top of that list. But the problem facing Sabella, or more so Philadelphia for that matter, was a lack of Western Sicilian members. Eastern Sicilian mobsters didn't have the acumen. They didn't have the understanding or the traditions that the West Side carried. So how do we know that Sabella trained under Traina? Well, an FBI report noted that Giuseppe Traina of New York is the individual responsible for Sabella's rise in Philly. The memo also notes that the FBI wasn't sure whether Sabella met Traina in New York or whether he met him in Philadelphia. But it's worth noting that Traina did own and operate Empire Yeast Company, which had a lot of business dealings in Philadelphia. So we're not sure how they meet, but we know they did. Another memo would state that Traina was 84 years old in 1964 and was considered inactive at that point. According to Nick Gentile, he said that Traina was the front boss or acting boss for Toto Dacula. Traina was considered by many to be in the streets as what they call a sleeper. And that's somebody who's known in all mob circles, respected universally and feared universally, but is smart enough to lay low and keep the authorities guessing. He also had completely a legitimate side to his life as well. And the fact that he was underneath Dacula speaks volumes. And therefore, it's not hard to believe that Traina then sort of mob hierarchy evaluates whether Sabella is a guy he can trust and put in South Philly. So, as we said, there's been a lot stated about Sabella that you just can't prove. And there are no records of his early days in New York or Philadelphia for that matter as well. So, in fact, so much has been suggested that I have actually seen oddly worded so-called facts about Sabella during Prohibition, but the reality is there's nothing you can point to that substantiates any of that, i.e. Wikipedia and mob content creators. So after Sabella arrives, it's worth noting, the year he arrives, 1919, between 1919 and 1920, there were 23 murders. And when Sabella takes over, he immediately controls loan sharking, the protection rackets, and oversees robberies, hijackings, and more. However, in his first year in charge, he was saddled with problems. In 1923, Sabella would be arrested. There was a bombing at Maggio's store on 9th Street. The newspaper attempted to draw a link between that and the recent bombing of the CCA. Fascist sympathizers were blamed for those bombings, and therefore anybody suspected of being a member or a former member of the Black Hand or Fascist Party was labeled a fascist. The two men arrested for this bombing were apprehended at 1 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Maggio, who owned the store, bailed both men out, totaling $3,000. And this is in 1923. That's a shitload of fucking money. And he claimed that the men were distant cousins who didn't mean any harm. In fact, the two arrested were arrested because they were seen frequently at the Italian market. And those two men were Giuseppe Giorgetti of New Jersey and Salvatore Sabella, godfather to Mr. Maggio's son, Peter. So by 1926, Sabella would move out of South Philadelphia for the safety of the suburbs. It didn't help that the Lanzettis and other groups were vying for power in South Philadelphia's narcotics and protection rackets. So as Sabella moves out of the city, he expands his business and his logistics into New Jersey and other places and begins to work with other crime families. Sabella was highly underestimated, and his real power was the fact that he was quiet. He wasn't seeing his name in the headlines every day like everybody else. However, in 1927, Sabella sort of becomes the public figure he never wanted to be. An indictment would make him a household name. And the day before Memorial Day in 1927, John Scopoletti, who was a known mobster, was driving west on Christian Street and passed by three Sicilian friends standing at the intersection of 8th and Christian Streets. Two of those Sicilians approached Anthony Zangi on both sides. One of them approached Anthony, kissed him on both sides of his cheek, and signaled to an awaiting car sitting on the corner of 8th, north of Christian, on the corner of 8th. North of Christian on 8th Street, Joe Zangi, brother of Anthony, came out of a restaurant with Vincent Scabby Cocosa. They walked south parallel to the car on the corner. At the same time, on the north side of 8th, Scopoletti's car slowly approaches the intersection. Shotguns suddenly appear at the windows, and the Sicilian friends draw their guns, and everybody began to fire at the Zangi brothers and Cocosa. As the smoke cleared, Joe Zangi and his pal Scabby were dead in the street. Famously, Freddie Cocosa, who would be known as the renowned singer Mario Lanza recalled once seeing his Uncle Vincent's body laid out in the street. Blood covered the streets and brain matter was plastered all over the walls of nearby buildings. Witnesses would write down Scopoletti's car license plate number and hand it to authorities. A car whipping down 8th Street had Salvatore Sabella, John Avena, and Domenico Polina standing on the running boards. They were actually seen. The intended target was Anthony Zangi. He was dazed. He stumbled around, realizing that he was the target because he had been warned for weeks. When the police arrive, Zangi tells them he was in fact the intended target and was willing to tell them anything they wanted to know. And the next morning, the headlines ran loud and clear, "The Underworld's First Squealer," and it ran in 5 newspapers in Philadelphia. Police, worried for his safety, locked him up, and while questioning him, he gave up basically everything. Later on that night, Sabella and others get pinched while eating dinner at Philip Polina's house. Sabella, John Avena, and Scopoletti were brought in front and center in front of Zangi and were identified. 2 weeks later, Andrea Restucci and Mike Malacuso would be arrested as well. And it would be the first time police and the public were seeing the Mafia front and center. According to Zangi, 2 weeks prior to those events, he was summoned to go see Sabella. And what he tells the cops is he tells them this. He explained that he went to the gin mills and asked for a loan from Sabella. The problem was Zangi already owed Sabella money. Sabella explains to him that he's already borrowed money he still owes and was not going to give him another dime. However, Sabella, enraged that somebody would ask him for more money considering they owed and were already behind, admonished him. And he also told him and his crew of misfits had better stop shaking down places that the Mafia was paid to protect, or else there was going to be a problem. And Sabella wasn't playing the fuck around. And Zangi, for whatever reason, didn't listen. He continued to haunt and shoot up stores in Little Italy and continued to make threats. And owners of those stores complained to Sabella to send a message to Zangi to stop or else. And so Sabella offers another warning. And Zangi tells him, basically, to fuck off. And then Zangi tells a bunch of guys on the street that he's going to do whatever the fuck he wanted and fuck Sabella. And word reaches back to Sabella, and that was enough. He reacts. He was said to have told John Avena in regards to the situation that if someone takes away your bread, you take his life. And so Sabella has a problem, right? Because Zangi was providing information to the cops. Sabella needed that to go away, and he offered somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000, which Zangi takes, and he disappears for a couple of weeks in the suburbs. And the problem was that the information that he gave was signed and sealed in an affidavit. And they couldn't keep that statement out of court, even if Zangi refused to testify. And so Zangi, from the outskirts of Philadelphia, claimed that he would get revenge. And he would tell the authorities about everything, from bootlegging to drugs to murder to payoffs to politicians and dirty cops who enabled Sabella to operate. So now he's infuriating everybody. And Zangi's information was somewhat new, and it was explosive because it showed how far the Mafia was advancing in Philadelphia. And as a result of his mouth, the police that were involved were named, and then they had to somehow explain their connection to Sabella or risk losing their jobs. So now they're put in a no-win situation. So a few weeks after their arrest, Dominic Festa, John Scopoletti, John Avella, and Salvatore Sabella and Polina were released. And it's worth noting that Joe Ida was arrested too, but he was not fingered by Zangi. Another man by the name of Luigi Quaranta was held, but only because he was a passenger in the car that was owned by Scopoletti, which was used in the murder. And so Sabella would try every trick, but nothing was working. And Sabella had a meeting, and he explained that somebody had to step up and accept the rap for the crimes. Luigi Quaranta, who was the youngest of the group, accepted culpability for that and would be convicted of 2 crimes and sentenced to life in prison at Eastern State. However, 6 years later, his sentence would be commuted. As for the others, Sabella paid off people to testify that he was with them when the alleged murder took place. And the rest would be acquitted and move on. Another interesting facet, and I've seen that Nadu especially misreport this bullshit constantly. But the Pennsylvania Crime Commission falsely reported that Sabella was deported after his 1927 arrest. I've heard Nadu say that. Well, he was deported after 1927, but that's not true, and it never was. And this is why you have to cross-reference everything. In fact, Sabella's immigration status was not even discovered at that time. As well, he was the father of 6 American-born children, and legally you couldn't deport him. He had American children. And at the time, Sabella was ingrained with politicians and cops. And he was somewhat protected by them. And multiple times, they refused, when asked, to talk to law enforcement about Sabella. They refused. So it's business as usual for Sabella, but the problem for Sabella was he was now known as a gangster. And not the polite, quiet, misrepresented Sicilian businessman that he wanted people to believe he was. As well, those murders were very public, and it changed the perception of the men on the corners that so many went to for help. And subjecting citizens to street violence like that changed the thought process of the cops and the citizens. And mainly it was a lack of discretion more than anything. And he's going to have another problem with the Lanzetti brothers. In the early 1920s, the Lanzettas began their career in organized crime, born and raised in Little Italy in South Philadelphia. They were Neapolitan by ancestry, and the 6 brothers grew up in a religious home, but it was a very, very, very poor household. The 6 boys, Leo, Pius, William, Teo, Ignatius, and Lucian. And they were all late teens, and by their late teens, they were all terrorizing people and the police and mobsters all over South Philadelphia. They were involved in about every crime, every angle you might expect them to be. For 10 years, cops would beg them to leave the area and go commit crimes somewhere else. And that's how bad they were and how unrelenting they were. But by the 1930s, they were dubbed the first family of crime in Philadelphia. And it wasn't until around 1939 when a body was found in a burlap bag in a mainline town, which was identified as Willie Lanzetti, the remaining brothers fled the area. And the Lanzettas, they weren't a huge crew, but they got a lot of acclaim during Prohibition. And that also made them, what also made them popular was the way that they were able to duck and dodge convictions after hundreds of arrests. They were the Teflon Don of their era, for sure. And what made them different was that they refused, like others, to pay off the cops or prosecutors or witnesses. They wouldn't pay they were too cheap to pay anybody off. Instead, what they do is they use the press to their advantage, helping them get acquittals and get a good spin on the narrative about who they were being framed. And it made the police look like they were basically witch hunting them. But it also drew the ire of the cops, especially with headlines like, "The Lanzettis beat the rap again." It infuriated the local cops in the establishment. The brothers also had a little bit of comedic side to them. And they also often gave quotes to the press. In one court case, Leo Lanzetti threatened to blow the head off of a prosecutor if his brother got 5 years in prison based on what he called a fucking frame-up. They, like Joey Merlino, ripped people off. When the numbers would hit, the Lanzettis would tip off the cops about who the better was, so he would get arrested and they wouldn't have to pay him off. They were career Welshers and refused to pay if somebody won. Just like Joey Merlino. Imagine that. Look at that fucking parallel. So even though a few of the Lanzettis would do jail time, they would actually go to jail and write letters to the press claiming they were framed and finger point on everybody else. They knew how to work the system and they knew how to work the press. In 1924, Willie, Pius, and Ignatius were sent to Holmesburg prison together on a narcotics charge. Irish cops on the beat in South Philadelphia constantly harassed the Lanzettas. And one particular Irish cop by the name of Jimmy Ryan used to beat the shit out of Pius Lanzetti constantly. And Pius never batted an eye, and he took the beating as the price of doing business. And the Lanzettis' main source of income was narcotics, right? They not only sold narcotics, but they also used them as well. They sold and used morphine, opium, and marijuana. And with moving drugs like that, often they would be threatened by other gangsters. And instead of walking the streets, these guys would go to their local police station and ask the policeman or the patrolman on duty to lock them up out of fear that they were going to be shot that day. It's crazy. But how the Mafia saw the Lanzettis was something different. And while the press built up egos for the brothers, many in the community saw them as selfish and cruel. They didn't bother to help anybody out in the community. All they did was take and take and take. And they were always out for their own pockets. And the Mafia saw them as reckless, stupid, and soft. And to the Mafia, they were the minor leagues of organized crime. A dysfunctional gang, nothing more, nothing less. And the Lanzettis saw the Mafia, more so Sabella, as soft, weak, and with little power. And after all, nobody had tried hurting them. Even when they pushed into Sabella's turf, nobody tried to touch them. However, in 1925, Sabella has enough of their bullshit. Sabella didn't like the press. He didn't like the attention they were getting, but he was caught in the middle sort of a quandary. He didn't want people in the community hurt by these guys. As they were reckless, they didn't give a shit about killing civilians, but at the same time, he also couldn't have them moving around freely, thinking they could do whatever the fuck they wanted either. It affected his business. And Sabella needed to make a statement, and Leo Lanzetti is going to pay first. In August of 1925, Leo stopped at a barbershop off 7th in Bainbridge for a haircut and a shave, and for some odd reason, he would tell the barber to make him look good, for this would be the last time he came in. Maybe he had a premonition, because the streets always have a way of filtering information, so perhaps he knew what was coming. As he walks out of the barbershop, a car with a New York license plate was sitting idle. 4 men in masks approach him from the car and open fire. He shot 5 times, twice in the head, once in the chest, once in the face, and once in the thigh. This murder was a message, but either the Lanzettis didn't care, or they didn't understand the resolve of the Sicilian Mafia, or Sabella for that matter, because they continued to fuck around with not just the Italian mob, but also the Jewish Mafia and any other fringe group they felt like fucking with. And at first, the police had no clue who ordered or participated in the murder of Leo. However, some months later, they would name Joe Bruno, or at least mention his name to be a part of that shooting. And Joe Bruno was known as a dope pusher, born Joe Ocasio in Brooklyn, New York. And Bruno himself had been clipped a few days prior to Leo Lanzetti on the northeast corner of 8th and Christian. He had arrived in Philadelphia in 1918 to push narcotics, and according to reports, he had his own crew working for him, had his own social club, and had a connection coming back and forth from New York to see him weekly. Bruno was shot 12 times. 45 slugs on his right side, and on his left side he was filled with buckshot. And somehow he survives this shooting for 2 days. But for 2 days while he's laying there in agony dying, he refuses to name who shot him. And at the end of that second day, he dies. And it turns out that Bruno borrowed cocaine and morphine on consignment from Ignatius Lanzetti and then refused to pay. And so the hit on Bruno started sort of a mini war. 2 days after Bruno was shot, a gun battle ensues on 9th and Christian between rival groups. 2 days after that gun battle, a gangster is shot on 8th and Christian, and bodies began showing up in the marsh where the Schuylkill and Delaware River meet. So another facet to Sabella's ascension was importing zips. Made men fleeing Sicily from Mussolini's wanton eradication of the Mafia, men would leave bringing letters with them from their bosses back in Sicily who were vouching for them, and Sabella takes them in. And he would push his family into South Jersey as well, running operations there concurrent with regular South Philadelphia operations. And during Prohibition times, just as an example, Chicago saw some 800 murders, whereas in comparison, there were only 22 in South Philadelphia. 22 versus 800. And the one thing that Sabella knew was that competition isn't a bad thing, but murder and mayhem are. And one of the things that Sabella did was to ensure that anybody got what they wanted, what they desired. And it was business for everybody. And rather than be greedy, Sabella made sure that he got along with the Jewish mafia, the Irish gangsters, and they all had trusting business agreements between them, which was the complete opposite of what Al Capone was doing back in Chicago. And so, when we come back next week, and I know I kind of rushed through this a little bit, but when we come back next week, we're going to talk Harry Riccobbene, because Harry Riccobbene, I believe, was made in 1927. Then on the other side of that, you have the Castellamare War. And we're going to see how Sabella plays his hand in all of this. So stick around. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. And next week, we're going to have a larger portion of the Philly stuff. I just had a lot of the armchair stuff. There was just too much other stuff this week. But it's going to get good. And I just am curious of what you guys think about the in-depth information, because when I did this the first time, I didn't have this information. Now that I do, it's like, holy shit. And you're going to be able to draw parallels between Phildelphia in 1906 to 1990. Now, we're not going to go that far. I'm not going to talk about Joey Merlino and those bunch of fucking morons, but we're going to go through Bruno. And what's very interesting when you compare and contrast the years, the decades, it's the same shit. And I've said it on this show before 1,000 times. The mob that runs Philadelphia now is 10 generations removed from Sicily. And in most cases, those guys aren't even Sicilian. They're Abruzzi, the Neapolitan, whatever. And that's the difference. Look at a good example, Scranton, the Buffalino crime family. Every single motherfucker that Russell Buffalino had was from Montadoro. They all came together and they were aligned. How many rats came out of Scranton during Russell Buffalino's tenure? Not, I don't think any. Maybe one. But it wasn't enough to damage them. Carlo Gambino, Castellamare del Golfo. Do we need to keep going? Or guys from Villabate. Guys from the same area had the same ideas, the same ideals, the same ideology, the same beliefs. That's why they were good. But then you take, John Gotti, who's Neapolitan. And the Gambinos was a very Sicilian family. And when John Gotti takes over, it becomes a Neapolitan crime family. Now the Gambinos have gone back to be straight Sicilian. But if you look and compare and contrast and do the parallels with Philadelphia, it's insane. Because you know what I told you before? History always repeats itself. And in this Philadelphia series, you're going to see it keep repeating the same shit over and over and over again. Sabella was the single-handed most successful boss in Philadelphia's history. And that goes to the 1930, whatever, when he's 40 years old. Everything after Sabella, well, Paulina, there was maybe one or two bosses after him that were relatively successful, but they saw the same stupid shit. Because the guys from Western Sicily, the old heads, we'll call them, they were all aligned. But if you look at when John Stanfa took over Philadelphia mob, remember what I told you? He came over from Sicily and he wanted to run Philadelphia like he was a Sicilian boss, like Carlo Gambino. That wasn't the wrong thing for him to do. The problem why it was an issue was because everybody he had within his Borgata at that point is 4, 5, 6 generations removed. They didn't grow up around that culture. They grew up in South Philadelphia. And that's why John Stanfa was never able to do what he wanted to do. That's the parallel. Anyway, have a great weekend, and we will see all of you back here next week for another episode of Mob Talk Radio.